Dialectics is the study of internal contradictions within all things and the interconnectedness of all phenomena. The contradictions arising within and between all things results in change and development over time, evolution. It is contrasted by metaphysics, the belief that material objects are static, separate, and unchanging. Metaphysics sees material objects and phenomena as being absolute and unalterable, being static and unaffected by internal contradictions or external relations with other objects and phenomena. Dialectics is therefore an analytical tool to observe the processes and change and development of objects from lower to higher stages, resulting from internal contradictions within objects and external contradictions between objects, which are all interrelated with one another. To the dialectician, it makes no sense to observe an object or a phenomena in isolation from everything else, as everything is interrelated, and even in a perceived isolation, there are internal contradictions within all things. Nothing is static or independent, and everything is in a state of change and interdependent. To highlight the difference between dialectics and metaphysics, we can look at the common argument that capitalism is just human nature or common sense. Here, human nature or common sense is taken by the metaphysician as something unchanged and immutable, whereas a dialectician argues that human nature and common sense, especially as it pertains to bourgeois consciousness, is a historically recent phenomena. There is no universal human nature and no universal common sense, and the concept of what constitutes human nature and common sense changes over time. Materialism versus idealism. Materialism is the belief that material reality exists independent and separate from our perception, and that the mind, including our perceptions, are products of material reality rather than separate from it. This is contrasted with idealism, the belief that the mind and our perceptions occur independently and separately from material reality, and that reality is only an illusion generated by the mind. To the idealist, perception takes primacy, and reality is a reflection of our perceptions. To the materialist, material reality takes primacy, and our perceptions are a reflection of material reality. The idealist would say, I think, therefore I am, whereas the materialist would say, I am, therefore I think. Again, we can use the example of human nature and common sense to illustrate the difference between materialism and idealism. Idealism asserts that human nature and common sense occur independently from material reality. Bourgeois consciousness magically emerges without a material basis from which it flows. Ideas simply float around in the ether just waiting to be discovered. The materialist knows that what constitutes human nature and common sense are products of material reality. Bourgeois consciousness would make no sense in a hunter-gatherer society, neither would bourgeois common sense. Just as feudal consciousness, such as a belief in the divine right of kings or the mandate of heaven, makes no sense in our contemporary bourgeois society. Ideas and scientific developments are products of past development. Charles Darwin did not theorize the existence of evolution in isolation, but his insights were developed and built off of previous stages of understanding heredity and morphology, such as the works of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. The materialist realizes that evolution existed prior to its discovery, whereas the idealist would say there's no way to know if evolution existed prior to our perception of it. The danger of idealism resides in its assessment of perception having primacy over material reality. To the idealist, unless the proletariat is able to perceive their exploitative conditions, it is unknown whether or not capitalism is fundamentally exploitative. If the proletariat are subjected to sufficient amounts of bourgeois propaganda, as we all are within bourgeois society, they may be unaware or in denial that their chains exist. They may be unaware of the contradictions between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie as being an antagonistic contradiction, and may be quick to adopt reformism as the solution to the class struggle, producing a theoretical dead end. The materialist knows of the existence of the chains regardless of whether the proletariat perceives them, and understands the nature of the antagonistic contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and how revolution, not reformism, is the only solution. The analytic tool of dialectics, being developed by the philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, was an inspiration to Marx and Engels, who sought to remove the idealist aspects of Hegel's dialectics and replace it instead with materialism. Dialectical materialism is thus an acknowledgement of the primacy of material reality, that our perceptions are a product of material reality, and that material objects and phenomena are all changing and driven by internal contradictions and interrelated external contradictions within all things. These observations can be used to form a model framework of the entire developmental history of human society, historical materialism. A good way to understand this concept is the antagonistic struggle between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. These two social classes did not arise out of thin air. Both were products of the development of capitalism, which in turn developed from feudalism. Neither class exists in isolation from one another, and both arose out of material development within society. Bourgeois consciousness and proletarian consciousness are manifestations of the material realities of the capitalist system. It would not make sense to observe the proletariat in isolation from their dialectical antagonist, the bourgeoisie, just as it would make no sense to explore the properties of death without also exploring the properties of life. One cannot be understood without the other. Neither would it make sense to explore these social classes without a wider observation of the capitalist system, as the emergence of these classes occur with the emergence of capitalism. It would also make no sense to observe capitalism without an understanding of feudalism and other forms of class society which preceded it. Due to the tools of dialectical and historical materialism, Marxists have a comprehensive theoretical and analytical framework to observe and explain the trajectory of human societal history and how it developed. Like all good scientific models, the model of dialectical and historical materialism has both explanatory and predictive power. Marxism, and therefore Maoism as its highest stage, is the most complete and updated model of revolutionary science. Contradiction and the three laws of dialectics. Friedrich Engels proposed three laws of dialectics. They are namely the unity and struggle of opposites, quantitative change leading to qualitative change, and the negation of the negation. We will summarize these laws of dialectics, beginning first with the concept of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, with a thesis and antithesis emerging simultaneously to one another and being in dialectic opposition towards one another, just as the struggle between the bourgeoisie and proletariat over the means of production. Here the capitalist mode of production represents the thesis, and the class struggle which arises from it the antithesis. Due to the antagonistic contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the only way for this contradiction to be dialectically resolved is through proletarian revolution and the construction of a dictatorship of the proletariat, also known as socialism, which represents the synthesis. When Maoists speak of contradiction, This means the internal and external dialectic struggles within and between all material objects and phenomena. As an example, in other scientific fields, this is represented in the struggle between order and entropy, of positive and negative, and in the forces of attraction and repulsion. Through understanding the concept of dialectical materialism, Maoists arrive at the understanding of inherent contradictions within all things, including society and the Communist Party itself. One such contradiction is the dialectic relationship between oppressor and oppressed. In other words, the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. This conflict results in a struggle between the two dialectically opposed forces, which produces a unity of opposites, the first dialectic law. One way to understand this unity and struggle of opposites is through the abstract example, like we mentioned before, of life and death. The properties of death cannot be understood without understanding the properties of life, and vice versa. One cannot be understood without the other, and one also cannot take place without taking place in context of one another. In the same manner, the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat can be understood. The two social classes are united in their opposition towards one another, and through the process of class struggle, the contradictions of bourgeois society seek resolution. Due to the lopsided nature of bourgeois society and its inherent contradictions, the only resolution results upon the completion of the socialist revolution. However, out of this new unity, new contradictions arise, such as the struggle of a communist party to maintain its revolutionary trajectory and not succumb to revisionism. This is represented in two concepts: unity, struggle, unity, in which dialectic forces are united in their opposition. This creates contradictions, a struggle, resulting in a conflict to overcome these contradictions. And when the struggle is over, there is a new unity, also with new contradictions to be faced and overcome. This concept is also called one divides into two, because society is in a constant state of development and reaches new stages with new contradictions. This means the process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis resumes, with a newly formed synthesis becoming the new thesis, and alongside it, a new antithesis emerges. In other words, one synthesis becomes two, a thesis and antithesis. Thus, history unfolds dialectically in a continuous spiral, as a thesis contends with its antithesis, finally rupturing and emerging as a synthesis. The transformative nature of dialectics also means that certain quantitative changes can lead to sudden qualitative changes. This is the second dialectic law. A buildup of class antagonisms within bourgeois society can reach a boiling point in the class struggle and lead to the conditions of revolution, just as a quantitative increase in water temperature can lead to a qualitative change in state from solid water to gaseous steam. The third dialectic law, the negation of the negation, can be summarized as when a new stage or order supersedes an older one. For example, when the contradictions of the capitalist thesis reaches its limits and the class struggle matures into proletarian revolution antithesis, this is the first negation. When the proletarian revolution successfully replaces the capitalist dictatorship of the bourgeoisie with the socialist dictatorship of the proletariat, this is the second negation, the negation of the antithesis and the emergence of the socialist synthesis. However, as with the principle of one divides into two, the new synthesis has within it new contradictions which must be resolved. This is why Maoists say that the class struggle resumes under socialism. Antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradiction. There are also two types of contradiction: antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions. the only resolution of antagonistic contradictions being the absolute victory of one force over its antagonist, such as the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, whereas the non-antagonistic contradictions may be solved through debate, such as conflicts between the agrarian peasantry and the industrial proletariat. A good example of this comes from the October Revolution. The forces of the Tsar were in an antagonistic contradictions with the forces of the Bolshevik Revolution, whereas the peasant class and the proletariat class of Tsarist Russia were caught in a non-antagonistic contradiction resolved through the policy of the Bolsheviks building a class alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. Primary and secondary contradictions. Making the matter more complicated is there are often interrelated contradictions, with some being the primary contradictions and some being secondary. Oftentimes the primary and secondary contradictions will swap places, with the secondary contradictions becoming the primary and vice versa. These concepts may seem difficult to grasp due to the abstract nature of its description, but we can use the historical example of the Chinese Revolution to display this property. Within the scope of the Chinese Revolution, the primary contradiction was the invasion of China by the Empire of Japan, while the conflict between the Communist Party of China and the Kuomintang was a secondary contradiction. Upon the defeat of Japan, the primary contradiction was resolved and the secondary contradiction took primacy, resulting in a new conflict between the recently established unity. After the defeat of the Kuomintang by the People's Liberation Army, a new unity and subsequent contradictions arose. The conflict between the socialist roaders and the capitalist roaders within the Communist Party of China. As we can see, by studying the nature of dialectical materialism and contradiction, we can understand the trajectory of human history as a series of struggles, which results in new unities and new contradictions, one dividing into two, unity into struggle, and then new unities. Dialectical materialism, when extrapolated across the entirety of human history, becomes historical materialism. But care must be taken not to take these concepts to mean the defeat of capitalism is inevitable, as history has more than shown that capitalism is capable of defeating revolution, and even after successfully overthrowing capitalism, the revolution itself can be undone from within. One of the main tasks, therefore, of the vanguard party is to identify the contradictions present in society and assess whether or not they are antagonistic or non-antagonistic, whether or not they are the primary contradiction or the secondary contradiction. So that concludes episode 4, our discussion on dialectical and historical materialism, our discussion of the 3 laws of dialectics, the nature of contradiction, antagonistic and non-antagonistic, primary contradictions and subsequent contradictions. Thank you everybody for watching. In the next episode, we will discuss an analysis of capitalism and a breakdown of the class struggle. Thank you so much for watching. Thanky King out.